Topic here is the politics of slavery. So here we see some language from the Constitution. Here it talks about the migration or importation of such persons. We are talking about slaves in this particular case, and that they shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation. So for the most part, in the United States Constitution, it does have language that addresses the issue of slavery, and this seems to be the only group that has language dedicated to the treatment of this group in our Constitution. Here are the points that we've been looking at in class: that the issue of slavery was never clearly resolved, and that slave owners and politicians use loopholes, which we've addressed in prior classes, and that the political process further allowed segregation or slavery in this case to exist. So we already addressed the politics of slavery. We were trying to figure out whether slavery was about economics, race, or politics. So for the most part, this screencast is about that political process, addressing the question, why did slavery last so long? So we know that in Congress, they needed to address this particular issue. So here you need to have some understanding of how the legislative branch of government works and some of the debate that took place at the Constitution Convention. How are we going to deal with representation? So in this particular map here, and I'm making these numbers up. This is just to make the math easy. So we see here, if 1 for each 100. So for every 100 people in your state is allowed to send one representative to Congress. What is that representative doing? Well, that representative is going to the federal government and is going to cast votes and negotiate on behalf of what that state would like to see happen on a federal level. So if we take Massachusetts, if we use this ratio of 1 rep for every 100, Massachusetts gets 4, they get 10, they get 8, and they get 6. Total, looks like we have 18, 19, 20, 22, we have 28. Notice how I'm using, for the most part, northern places. And so what's going on here is that in Congress, or you are able to pass laws for the country, they're trying to figure out how are we going to create representation in Congress. So if we look here, and again, I'm making these numbers up, using the same number, we would get 8, 9, 7, and 5, which leaves us with, let's see, I do this math in my head, 16, 21, we would have 29 here. So we'd have 29 in the southern section. Oh, here, I already lost track. 29, 18, 19, 20, 22. Why is it so difficult? 28 to 29. So it does seem to be fairly even of a split, 28 to 29. But now we throw this what if question, and the numbers don't seem to be lined up here. But let's say in Virginia, out of their 800 people, 700 are slaves and 100 are free. So the question here is whether or not we should count the slave population. So we have 700 slaves and we have 100 free. So they're up for 8 votes that are going to represent the state of Virginia in the legislative branch of government for the federal government. But the question here is, should they be allowed to count their slave population? If we don't count their slave population, then they are only sending 1 rep. You're going to argue, well, why should they not be able to count their slave population? Well, they consider their slaves to be property. So if we take these numbers here, the free population is 100 for all of these states. That would mean instead of getting 8, they would get 1. Instead of getting 9, they would get 1. Instead of getting 7, they would get 1. Instead of getting 5, they would get 1. The South would have a total of 4 votes. Now, if we take the votes back up here, and we use the logic of the North and the South with that evil division, the Mason-Dixon line, that would mean that the South would get 4 votes. And then we use our math, I already forgot 14, 28. it would be 28 votes for the northern states and 4 for these. And that would pretty much mean that they would dominate the federal government. They would dominate the legislative branch of government. And they probably would be in a position to outlaw slavery and to get rid of it. Question, should the slaves be counted as part of the population? Pro and cons. I guess this is going to depend on which side you're on. So now we get to the issue of this particular point here. So if we're going to use the states, and I'm not done with that section. What do we have? 28 to 29, yet they actually have like 4 if they don't count their. All right, so on the issue of representation in Congress, how many you can send, the southern states are going to argue, yes, we want to be able to count our slaves. However, on the issue of sending taxes to the federal government, so now each state has to send tax money to the federal government. They're arguing, the South is arguing, the southern states, that on the issue of federal taxes, we don't want to count the slave population. So when it comes to representing in Congress, when we want the 29 votes, we want to count the slaves. When it comes time to pay taxes to the federal government, we don't want to count the slaves and we want to pay $4. So if you're not sure about what's going on here, the federal government, represented by this star, needs to collect money from the states for the federal government. How much should they pay? Well, it's going to be based on population. They're going to pay 28, they're going to pay 29. However, the southern states are saying, well, no, we want to only pay 4 because we're not counting our slave population. So if you're wondering what just happened here, the South is pretty much using a loophole and trying to pull a fast one. They're trying to say, well, on the issue of representation, we want to count our slaves because it benefits us. But on the issue of paying taxes, we don't want to count our slaves because this is not going to be beneficial. We're going to wind up paying more taxes. They basically want to pay $4 as opposed to $29. They want to count the slave population when it's beneficial, which is what this particular slide here is and why we get to the 3/5 compromise. And that is the compromise. My experience, whenever you see this word in a African-American history class, that means that somebody just figured out a loophole. That means somebody just kind of gave a midway solution to whatever the issue is at hand. So in this case, they could have dealt with the issue of slavery by standing firm. The North could have easily have said, we're not going to count the slave population. We are only going to count free people, and that would have put the South at a disadvantage. They can't do that because they come up with the compromise where they say, we're going to count for every 5 people your state has, we will only count 3, and that is going to allow us to count your slave population. So it looks like here, this is the 5 slave population. They're only going to count 3, so I guess these 2 don't count or matter. And the issue is going to further get complicated. Should slavery exist in new states? So let's just say the North and South is split 28 to 29. If you allow new states, let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4 new states, if these states come in as free or slave states, that is definitely going to be an issue. So let's just say all states come in as free states. That would now say, at a minimum, let's say we get 3 electoral or votes, reps to Congress. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one, let's say, gets 3. That would then take 3, 6, 9, 12. We would take 12. And now we would be with a 40 to 29 split. So that's what's going on here. The legislative votes matter. The population matters. Do we count the slave population? That seems to be the issue here. So how does the federal government deal with this? They passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They banned slavery in the added territory. And here we start to see the balance possibly get overthrown. And what are we going to do when more states become available, more land? The issue is going to be problematic. If you are wondering about the division here, that's the Missouri Compromise line, which again, compromise, where they're drawing this border and they're pretty much dividing the free states from the slave states through this border. So that is a compromise that in some way overturns the Northwest Ordinance, because over here, they're banning slavery in the added territory. And here they're revising it saying, yeah, well, we're not going to really do that. It's going to depend where you are based on the Missouri Compromise line. If you're above it or below it is going to be the deciding factor. Then we get to the Kansas Nebraska Act. This one, we see the country divided. Again, Congress, the politics of slavery, not really coming up with a solution that clearly ends or clearly maintains the institution of slavery. They seem to be in a deadlock. Now, I don't know what the votes are here, and I'm making this up, but let's say it's 40-40. We're split. You can never end slavery with a 40-40 split, which is why the new states coming into existence, once again, are crucial. So as the United States expands, we get this section, those states are going to matter because they're going to possibly overthrow the balance in Congress, which is why in the beginning they were so concerned about having reps in Congress, because there's this understanding that you can end slavery or just prolong it. This is an interesting one. So it seems that they're deadlocked. This greenish color is a free state. This blue color is a slave state. And then this one just says, determine it by popular sovereignty. So basically what's going on here is this section, whoever moves there, you can determine it. Popular sovereignty, whatever the people living there want is what they can have. Notice how the federal government is not taking a clear stand. Federal government represented by the star. They're not saying we're going to end slavery. Slavery is already in existence, so there seems to be no threat to it. But they're ultimately saying, well, whoever moves there, moves there. So let's use my fake numbers again. If it's a 40-40 split in Congress and we're adding these areas now, that could be, let's say, 12 votes. That 12 votes could either be the difference for this side or this side. But they're not coming up with a clear solution. They're saying whoever moves there can determine. So what do you think is going to happen? The people from this section are going to move there. The people from this section are going to move there, and it's going to be a mess, which will lead to the Bleeding Kansas situation. Whoever moves there can determine what will happen. Hopefully this graphic still works, even though it's Wikipedia. I do like the graphic. I think here they're looking at the slave, the free slave and the free states. And so the message here is, as the United States expands, the compromises were a way to kind of keep the balance at a tie, which eventually leads to the Civil War, this frustrating breaking point among the two sides that are fighting for either keeping slavery or ending slavery. That's it for the politics.